Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Ross, and I'm the director of the USC Kazin Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life, and I'm also Dean's Professor of History at USC. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of our event partners, the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and the USC Armenian Students Association. With Yom HaShoah having occurred last week and Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day occurring on, pardon me, everyone, occurring on April 24th, this is an opportune time to reflect as a community on the impact of genocide and intergenerational trauma, which our two communities have experienced both as survivors and as descendants of survivors. Today, we will explore trauma's impact from many perspectives: cultural, religious, biological, and sociological. And it is our hope that today's panel discussion will help our communities understand expressions of trauma while providing pathways to look backwards and forwards at the same time. At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague and partner for today's event, Dr. Salpi Ghazarian, the director of the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. She'll provide us with an overview of the event as well as introduce today's panelists. But first, let me introduce her. Salpi joined the USC Institute of Armenian Studies in 2014 after returning to Los Angeles from Armenia, where she co-founded and directed the Civilitas Foundation, a think tank and advocacy organization. Civilitas and its media program, CivilNet, pioneered a new culture of responsible journalism through online television and data-based reporting. Salpi's previous posts include Special Assistant to the Foreign Minister of Armenia from 2000 to 2008, the West Coast Coordinator for the Ghazarian Institute for Contemporary Armenian Research and Documentation, and as an editor and publisher of Armenian International magazine. And Salpi is also a USC alumna. Welcome, Salpi. I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the introduction, but also thank you for the invitation to cooperate with the Kazin Institute on this day and on this topic. Everyone says there are so many similarities between the Armenian and Jewish experiences, and that is certainly true, as specific as each is. And I think that now, as the decades have gone by and the survivors themselves, both the Armenian survivors and the Jewish survivors, are by and large no longer with us, then we are both challenged with the very immediate matter of not just remembering, but also making our memories relevant to the human rights community, to the international community, so that the concept of never again isn't just a slogan, but actually begins to take root in a world where I think we're all wondering if that's ever going to happen. We're grateful, you and I both, to Peter Mancall, who has agreed to moderate today's program. Peter is the Divisional Dean for Social Sciences at USC Dornsife. He is Professor of History and Anthropology and the Director of the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute. He's also the author of 7 books, including most recently, The Trials of Thomas Morton, An Anglican Lawyer, His Puritan Foes, and the Battle for a New England. He is currently writing American Origins, which will be volume 1 of the Oxford History of the United States. And clearly those American origins include centuries of our own violence against indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans. And in fact, one of his main theses in the recent Morton volume is that colonization is a process that allows the rulers to justify violence and dispossession. So not only does his field of study overlap with today's topic in that sense, but also Peter Mancall has become the patron saint of digital humanities at USC, an area of study where digital technologies and the humanities intersect, overlap. And so very important when we're studying issues that arise in post-genocide communities. So Peter, I hope it's okay that I called you the patron saint. Welcome, and thank you very much for agreeing to moderate today's program.
Well, Salpi, thank you. That was generous. I'm not in any way the patron saint of digital humanities, but we do run a little program, which I think is a little engine that could. So thank you. There are a lot of people doing great digital humanities work at USC. I am delighted to be here today. I'm honored to be here on this occasion where we will get expert commentary from 4 brilliant panelists about the nature of genocide in the modern era. As Salpi mentioned, my work really is rather long ago. I work on the 16th and 17th centuries, but there are parallels. One of the things that historians do, of course, is try to understand, situations in their historic specificity. I think that's really what we're going to be doing today. The panel is going to approach questions of genocide from different perspectives. So what I'm going to do is just introduce each of the 3 so far unintroduced panelists, and then I'm going to start them off with some questions, and we'll go back and forth as a panel for some time. And then later in this program, we will welcome questions from the audience, which I will then sort of feed to the panel as best as I can. So I'm very happy, and I'll do this in alphabetical order. I'm very happy today to welcome to this session Dr. Umit Kurt, who is the Polanski Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute and a lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's a historian of the modern Middle East with a specialization in the era of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the history of the early Turkish Republic, mass violence, and ethnicity and nationalism. He's the author of several books in Turkish and English, including The Spirit of the Laws, The Plunder of Wealth in the Armenian Genocide, and then a brand new book entitled The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province, which was, I believe, just published by Harvard University Press. We're also going to be joined by an old friend of mine, Beth Meyerowitz, who is professor of psychology and preventive medicine at USC, and also a licensed clinical psychologist. Beth's research and teaching focus on the psychological well-being of individuals who face highly stressful situations, such as cancer and genocide. Her recent research has included investigation of post-traumatic stress and resilience among survivors of the 1994 Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. She is currently investigating how memory works and scholars who engage with testimony from genocide survivors and how they experience the challenges and rewards of doing the kind of important work that they are doing. And the last panelist is another friend of mine, Michael Renov, who holds the Haskell Wexler Endowed Chair in Documentary and is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the USC School of Cinematic Arts, where he is also Professor of Critical Studies. Michael's teaching and research interests include documentary theory, autobiography in film and video art and activism, as well as representations of the Holocaust. His works include Hollywood's Wartime Woman, Representation and Ideology, and the Subject of Documentary. And he is the editor of the Visible Evidence book series, which I believe now has something like 17 volumes in print. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to start asking questions of the panelists. And I want to thank everyone for coming to this event sponsored by both the CASD and the Armenian Studies Institute. So Beth, I think I'm going to start with you. And I'm going to ask you just to get us rolling, given both the breadth of your expertise and the depth of your understanding about trauma. This is going to come off more as an observation than a question, but I hope you'll have a great answer, I'm sure. I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of the legacy of trauma, not just on the, let's say, the initial victims of genocide, but on the second and third generations, about how trauma it continues to survive in the people who are the descendants of violence. So I hope that was enough clarity there, and I'm going to turn to you. So can you get us started, please?
Thank you. I'd love to. Let me first, before I start to address your question, let me first mention that in addition to commemoration of the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, last week also, well, on April 7th, was the start of Kwibuka, which is commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. So I also want to send thoughts out to our friends in Rwanda and in the US and elsewhere in the world who have gone through that. Let them know that our thoughts are with them at this time. And I think the fact that we have at least those 3 genocides that are commemorated in April helps us understand that many communities have historical trauma in their pasts, have had that experience of some really overwhelmingly traumatic event. And one of the things that we've discovered is that those events, the impact of those events, don't go away when the event ends. Certainly it continues for the people who are experiencing that event, but in addition to that, there's an intergenerational transmission. So we've seen almost a contagion across generations. It can happen in through a variety of pathways, through family life, through intrauterine hormonal levels, through epigenetics, through a variety of ways where that sense of trauma, that sense of being in a survival mode gets passed from generation to generation. One of the first people who coined the term historical trauma was Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who was writing about the trauma that was passed on through generations for Native Americans who were sent to residential schools. And she noted that there were 3 characteristics that lead to historical trauma. One is the presence of a severe, widespread, life-threatening, uncontrollable events. In other words, a massive trauma. Secondly, the trauma was experienced by a group of people with a shared identity, be that ethnic, national, tribal, a shared identity, religious, and the trauma often was directed at them exactly because of that shared identity. And then third, the experience of the trauma spans multiple generations across time and space. So with the genocides we're discussing today, it certainly meets those criteria. And so we see that intergenerational transmission. Now, the behavioral indicators of that differ by generation. So in the first generation, the generation that experiences the trauma, in addition to the standard sort of reactions to traumatic stress, we often see silence. We often see a conspiracy of silence where there's a reluctance to speak about what happened, a quietness. By the second generation, there's a great interest in trying to understand that, knowing what happened, and feeling a sense of responsibility, perhaps a sense of distrust in the world, other things that might go along with that. And then for subsequent generations, we see an emergence more perhaps of guilt and a sense of survivor guilt, a sense of strong grief, and a wish to do something to make things right. Does that address your question?
Beth, that was a great way to start it. Before we turn to the next person, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Can you just briefly explain epigenetics, if that's not a familiar concept to people listening today?
Yeah, so epigenetics is the study of how the environment and other factors affect genetic expression. So it's the activation and deactivation of genes. It's not about changing the actual DNA structure. It's about how those genes are activated or deactivated. And that can be a result of environmental factors. For example, smoking can cause that. Or it also can be an inherited, there can also be epigenetic inheritance.
Thanks, that's great. And thank you for that broad overview. And I appreciate, I appreciate your linking it in with the indigenous experience in the Americas, as well as we're going. So let's now turn a little bit more specifically, and let's start with the Armenian case. So Salpi, I'd like to turn to you. Can you, sort of following Beth up, or go wherever you want to go, but talk about sort of, the layers of trauma sort of in the Armenian situation, and let's see how this conversation progresses. Thanks.
Sure, Peter, thank you. It's ironic, isn't it? Beth, you said conspiracy of silence. And then, of course, you talked about the inheritance of trauma. And I'm sure that irony completely escaped the survivors themselves, who thought that through this conspiracy of silence, they were protecting all the rest of us, right? The Armenian case certainly has its very specific layers of trauma for a couple of reasons. One is the actual events themselves, the intensity, the extent of the success of the genocidal policy. Out of a population of 2 million living in the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 1918, 1.5 million died. So, and the 1.5 million were largely in the eastern provinces near the Russian border, but there were a great many also in Istanbul, in the capital, fundamentally entwined in Ottoman life, in Ottoman leadership, in cultural life. And so the devastation of this being uprooted completely from centuries of living on your own lands, that is something that fundamentally has not been addressed. Part of the reason it hasn't been addressed is because the Turkish government continues to deny that this happened, which is quite still unexplainable when you consider that in the final days of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans themselves invited and tried nearly 80 actual implementers of the genocide. But then after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and with Republican Turkey, both the new government of Turkey completely set that aside and the responsibilities that come with it, but so did the world. The Brits and the French and the Americans, nobody wanted to deal with that at that point. They needed a solid, stable Turkey. And so the denial continues to be layers of trauma. Not only did my grandmother live the life of an orphan, grabbed from her mother's lap when she was 5. The only reason she knows her name is because her mother screamed it. Not only did she live that life and pass that on to us, but then on top of it, she is a liar. Her story is not true. So that layer of trauma continues with the descendants. And finally, we continue to cohabit. The Republic of Armenia is at Turkey's borders. So there is cohabitation in a neighborhood where there is absolutely no expression of regret or repentance. In a recent Los Angeles Times article, Mark Arax had said, imagine if Germany was right next to Israel and unrepentant. So the security, the safety issues, the development issues of the Republic of Armenia are at stake. And the trauma and the fear is not just imagined. It was proven over this last several months when Azerbaijan decided to attack Armenia with Turkey's military and strategic support. So it's a very complex layering. And with a diaspora as large as the Armenian diaspora, the ability, the intent, the desire to both explain this and at the same time to explain this to the world community and to try to explain this to Armenians, the next descendants, and deal with it, it's a complex process.
Thank you, Salpi. That's obviously powerful and moving testimony, and sort of an invitation to hear from a historian. And fortunately, Umit is an expert exactly on this question. That is the question of trying to come to terms with Salpi's question, which is what seems to be to many people in the world, in inability to admit that this genocide took place. But Umit, this is your area of expertise, not mine. But I'm wondering if you can talk about that. I mean, this is obviously in the news quite frequently. Your work is very important exactly on this point. If we can keep this going by you providing sort of specific historical angles so we can understand both the sort of general ideas about trauma that Beth introduced and then sort of the layers of the Armenian case, as Salpi just talked about it.
Thank you very much. Actually, following up the Salpi's important remarks, here we are talking about a foundational issue for Turkey. We are talking about, imagine a country and a society considering and approaching this matter from the point of view of existence and or absence, because your existence, your foundation was based on the absence of a certain group of people, religious people, nationalist people, and first and foremost Armenians. The whole idea of Turkish nation state, the modern nation state, was based on the absence of Ottoman Christians, Armenians first and foremost, as well as Assyrians and Ottoman Greeks. And these these absences were carried out by ethnic cleansing, destruction of society, certain groups in their entirety, and also genocide, is mass violence. So, and this denialist policy of the state has been being supported by the society, because in Turkey and also in international arena, denialist policy of Turkish Republic or Turkish state, or denialism in Turkey as an ideology or as a political tendency, has always been ascribed to the state. But state denialist policy has been received great deal of support from different sections of society, because ancestors of these groups of society were also involved in this mass crime, this crime against humanity as well. They plunder Armenian properties, they acquire Armenian assets, and they were involved in the destruction, physical violence process, and all these issues also touch upon them. And that's why we are in Turkey having this notion of partnership of not reckoning with the past and especially the dark annals of the past, because every society has a certain historical development process. The societal actors who are agents of this whole historical process preserve a dynamic relational network with history as they are making it. Some societies normalize their relations with history and can openly discuss their own, yet others are incapable of doing so, because their past and present are intertwined in a way that causes them to lose their sense of reality. So the Armenian question in the eyes of Turkish state and Turkish society, overwhelmingly codified, and the experiences that surround it form the prominent medium where this lack of a sense of reality within the social and political culture of Turkey is most visible. In this context, it's possible to claim that Turkey's timidity to question its past deepens the layers of oblivion of political and social history that are constructed upon each other. So the basic inventory of all of the incidents and periods that Turkey has not examined in terms of cause and effect, the sufferings, fears that it has not confronted, the victims with whom it has not formed a dialogue or simply avoided any interactions, provides a sufficient glimpse into those layers of oblivion, actually. So if one takes the establishment of the Turkish Republic as the point of origin, the foundation of all these layers would undoubtedly be so-called Armenian deportation. The Armenian question is perhaps the most controversial subject today, as the public, both official and national historiographies, let's say, have an unquestioning acceptance of the Turkey's official denialist view on the Armenian genocide. This acceptance demands denial from cradle to grave. The incident, so quote unquote, that happened to Ottoman Armenians in 1915 is independent of any acts by the Armenians, implementation of the decision by the ruling Committee of Union and Progress Party and its central committee to eradicate them in total or in part from almost all parts of Anatolia, Asia Minor. All these ahistorical remarks such as, but the Armenians revolted or they step us in the back, disregard the fact that a murder was committed, and this should be the primary subject of the debate. Unless this fact registered with the public, it's only natural for others to put forward arguments that revolve around the idea that we did not kill Armenians for nothing. That has been always the defense mechanism even Turkish intellectuals and also Turkish statesmen and the different sections of Turkish society came up with. So prerequisite for a debate on whether an act qualifies as genocide is the acceptance of that act as a crime, as murder. So Turkey's main issue is not the question of whether what happened was genocide, it's whether what happened was a crime. In this equation, Turkey does not admit at a very basic level that a crime was committed, which from Turkey's perspective renders the question of whether those acts qualified as genocide meaningless. So this situation of Turkey brings forth, of course, other questions, like what is the main difficulty in proving that genocide occurred? What are the factors that qualify the acts of 1915 as genocide? And so the 1948 definition of genocide requires that the act in question be committed with intent to destroy. Therefore, one must prove that the perpetrator had such intention, which obviously it's difficult to do since the perpetrators cannot be expected to have documented their intent to destroy or to have clearly stated it. It's the task of the historian to clarify that intent. So to me, it's possible to find traces of such intent by examining the deportation procedures of 1915 as recorded even in Ottoman archives from a serious historical perspective. One is then able to see that deportations were planned so that the Armenians could not reach the destinations where they're supposed to be relocated. So this includes the severe conditions under which deportations were carried out, the attacks on the convoys by gangs and tribe members, the confiscation of Armenian property through abandoned property laws, and etc. and etc. On the other hand, the partial accessibility of Ottoman archival materials leads to near idolization of Ottoman documents and the disregard of Armenian materials, sources, primary and secondary literature on the issue. So knowledge of Armenian should be deemed as important as knowledge of Ottoman Turkish for those who study the historical problematic of the Armenian genocide. So the biggest methodological mistake for a historian here is to accept Ottoman documents as the sole truth without proper comparative, critical, and detailed evaluation with other sources. So it is indeed possible to claim that historiography, which relies solely on Ottoman records to prove that the 1915 Armenian genocide was nothing but the relocation of Ottoman Armenians, is fueled by the denialism of Turkish society, which is rooted in the effort to not remember and to resist anything that reminded of the Armenian question. So that sort of denialism, in essence, shows just how briefed of the memory today's society is. So,
thank you, Umit. That was very, very powerful. You know, much of what you said there. I was struck by one of your phrases. You referred at one point to a sense of reality. You know, so his, you know, and really sort of questions of evidence. And I'm reminded, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of this, but just a week or so ago, New York Times Book Review ran an article, some people here may know this book, about a new book about a Holocaust photo, an entire book about one picture. It seems to me this is a perfect time to bring in someone who is a real expert on visual evidence and documentary filmmaking, and that's Mancall Renov. Mancall, can you sort of help us in our understanding of sort of what constitutes evidence, how we think about evidence, preserve evidence, any direction you want to go, but the relationship between sort of the visual, other kinds of evidence, and these larger political, cultural, social, psychological issues that we're wrestling with?
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. And I'm very grateful to be part of the conversation. One thing I would say, and it's in response to what we've just been hearing about intent and motivation on the part of the perpetrator. One thing, a way that documentary film has been very active and I think effective is by asking questions about what are the recollections of survivors themselves. How do we record, how do we bear witness or allow them to bear witness for us what their experience was back during this moment in time? And that's where the documentary film has really come into play and taken an important role. I think we're all in, most of us, maybe all of us know about the Shoah Foundation, which is housed at USC. And through that, we have memory archived in the way of survivor testimony. More than 52,000 of them are survivor testimonies from the Holocaust. There are others from other genocidal experiences, including the Armenian genocide. And so I want to think about that, which is to say, the documentary film, by way of testimony, including what is somewhere on the borderline between testimony and interviews with survivors, provides a way for eyewitness evidence to be not only amassed and archived, but here's the important point, because documentary film is still an art form and it can have a powerful impact on audiences. So one of the things to keep in mind is what you could ask the question, what's the function of documentary films that contain strong survivor testimony, that bear witness to a traumatic experience, an act of genocide in the past? And the answer is, for many, that these films or testimonials can produce a certain effect on audiences, that it can make them, puts them in a position in which they are potentially willing to take on and have a secondary experience of the suffering of others. Some call it empathy, but this idea of just a position that you're placed in, of listening and being, therefore, a secondhand witness to something that once happened. So you have people who themselves are eyewitnesses, who experienced it in their own bodies and experiences. And then you have that transferred to film. And that's important because of something that Salpi said much earlier, which is that the survivors now of the Armenian genocide, there can be very, very few if these years were from 1915 through 1918. And the same is increasingly the case for survivors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. So what we have now is we have a kind of second order. And I want to really put the spotlight in the couple of minutes that I have on one collection and a series of films made by J. Michael Hagopian, who was himself a child survivor. He was born in 1913, came to the United States as a survivor with his mother, got a Ph.D. at Harvard, first went to Berkeley, then a Ph.D. at Harvard in international relations, and then fought during World War II. When he came back, and I love this part of the story, he spent 3 years on the with the GI Bill of Rights studying filmmaking at USC. And after that period of time, he more or less put aside that PhD and began to make documentary films. It wasn't until a little bit later that he began to make documentary films about the Armenian experience and about the genocide that had occurred. And it was in part because of a first moment of interview with someone who I think really is, his name was Armin Wegener, and he had been a German soldier during World War I, and he had been stationed in the Ottoman Empire and was utterly traumatized by what he had seen and haunted by his own experience, not therefore as either a perpetrator or the recipient of the genocidal violence, but really as a bystander. But it turned him into a lifelong activist for human rights. And this one moment in 1965, when Hagopian interviewed Wegener, changed his career from making very good documentary films about many things to really being obsessed with making films about the Armenian genocide. And from that point on, for over 40 years, he lived to be 97 years old. His collection is part of the Shoah Foundation now, with 400 hours of interviews conducted in 13 languages in 10 nations. And it's a very, very powerful testimony and series of testimony. I will close with this thought. He was a filmmaker, but what he was really obsessed with was evidence. And he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm never going to interview anyone under the age of 8 because they would not be a credible witness. I only want people who saw it and experienced it firsthand. I don't want any hearsay. And why? Because he lived to be 97, and until the day he died, his entire concept was about this lifelong journey of his and this legacy that he left behind and is now part of the Shoah Foundation, that it would someday be used as evidence in a court of law or in an international tribunal, and that it would stand as evidence and proof. And that's why documentary films are important, because they can change people's minds and hearts, and they can also provide persuasive evidence of things that once occurred.
Thank you, Michael. That was really poignant. I remember some years ago when the Hagopian collection, was sort of joined or added into the Shoah Foundation Institute collection, and 400 hours, just sort of staggering amount of material, especially then combined with, what was already in the Shoah Foundation archive. But the number that always comes out to me when thinking about that archive is that if you sat down, and the Armenian stuff enhances this, if you were to sit down in front of a computer screen and turn it on and start to watch, if you wanted to watch all of it, you wouldn't get up from your screen for 13 years. I mean, it's a staggering amount of evidence about human cruelty and survival and sort of those important lessons. But it's also, those archives have become a device, a way to understand not only the historic traumatic experience, which has been so central to, say, Umit's work and much of what Salpi has done, but also how we understand psychology. So I want to bring Beth back into the conversation here. And Beth, I wonder if you can I know that you've done some work, not only in the field, but also with people who have been studying film, in the archives. And I wonder if you can, what your sense is about the traumatic experience, if that's the right word, of the people who then become witnesses to the filmed evidence of the initial trauma. I might have phrased that in a somewhat awkward way, but I think you'll have a way of straightening that out. But can you pursue that a little bit, please?
Well, what I mentioned before about the contagion that can happen with trauma, that's not limited to intergenerational contagion. There's a lot of evidence of vicarious or secondary trauma where observing, learning about, hearing about other people's traumatic experiences can lead to a vicarious secondary traumatic response in the person who's receiving that information. But I'd like to say that for the people who do the work of the memory workers who gather this information, while it is true that I want to give a shout out here to my collaborator on this project, Dr. Martha Shroud, who's part of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for the Study of Advanced Genocide Research, that it's life-changing for people. It's life-changing for people. People describe this as a central theme, a central narrative in their lives, to have been able to watch and hear about the experiences of other people. So when Michael talks about what a great impact these testimonies, this documentary evidence can have, we have seen it very much. And I'd also like to add that it has an enormous impact on the family members of people who may never have heard these stories before, who may never have known what their families went through. So very important collections. I also want, if I could just take 1 minute to respond to something that Dr. Kurt was talking about in terms of the response of the Turkish government. I just want to note that many of the communities that we talk about in terms of intergenerational traumatic contagion, the trauma to which they're exposed is not over. These are communities that have continued to see ongoing exposure to traumatic stress. The Nagorno-Karabakh War, the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the US and in Europe now. And one of the things that makes this especially difficult for people to handle is the construct that in psychology we call institutional betrayal. The idea that the institutes that were supposed to have supported you, were supposed to have protected you, betrayed you. They were not there, they did not see you. And that sense of not being seen, not being heard is so central to the transmission of traumatic stress that being seen through documentary, being seen through major organizations, being interested in you, asking you to tell your story, the impact of that cannot be overstated.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks. I'm going to have a few more questions for the panelists, but I would like to, at this point, start to invite the audience if they want to put things in the Q&A, because I do want to open this up fairly soon. But before we open it up, I want to I'm going to sort of go one more round here. And Salpi, following what Beth talked about this idea of intergenerational intergenerational trauma in some sense. I wonder, you've been at SC now for a while, and you're leading this phenomenal institute. Could you sort of maybe give us an overview of how you see the differences between the Armenian experience on the one hand and the Jewish experience on the other, just to sort of open it up? And then I think we'll turn to Umit to sort of drill back into that as well, please. Is that okay, Salpi? Thank you.
Pleasure. I just want to say something about Michael Hagopian, since Michael spoke of him. He was a gem of a human being, and not only did he want to, and this kind of comes back to your question, Peter, so I'm not going too far off the farm here. He also wanted to interview missionaries, because there were so many American missionaries there at the time, and their records, their letters, their testimonies, their first-person experiences were so valuable. So he went to New Jersey, and he wanted to interview Dr. Stanley Kerr, who was the grandfather of Steve Kerr, the Golden State Warriors coach, Steve Kerr. His grandfather was a missionary in Marash, Umit, am I remembering right? I think he was
Marash, yes, Lions of Marash, he wrote a book, yeah.
He wrote a book called The Lions of Marash, and so Michael Hagopian thought, this is a perfect candidate to hear stories firsthand. He went to New Jersey, and Dr. Kerr said, I can't talk to you on camera, because as I age, I realized that we here in the US are as responsible for what we did to the Native Americans as the Turks are for what they did to the Armenians. And I feel guilty that I am not able to do something about that. And so he did not agree to speak on camera. And I think that example of the desire to take personal responsibility, the inability to take personal responsibility in the way in which the world presents itself. You can only do so much because the Turkish government is going to say, wait, what are you talking about? You can only do so much because at the end of the day, today with Rwanda only 20, 30 years ago, Beth, it's, and we watched it and we read about it. And then just a year later with Srebrenica, we see it, we watch it, and we think that because the world sees it, that somehow something is going to change. And yet sovereignty trumps everything. And the ability for the international community, for any of us to actually do something towards never again. So differences with the Jewish experience, I think, come back to that in the case of Holocaust survivors, they, at the very least, received the solidarity of the world community, a bit late, you might say, but something there. In the case of the Armenian survivors and their descendants, including my kids, I'm 3-4 generations down, there isn't that sort of solidarity yet. And there even wasn't during, for example, the Nagorno-Karabakh war just 6 months ago, when Turkey audaciously, with impunity, said, we're going to back up our ally, Azerbaijan, and Armenians should not be living where they are living. It sure sounded awfully familiar. And again, this, on the one hand, the world is watching, right? And social media is out there. On the other hand, no repentance, therefore impunity, therefore can be repeated. It's, I hope later, Peter, you'll ask, about the great moral responsibility on all of us, so I can continue on that theme. But a fundamental difference is impunity and non-repentance.
Well, Salpi, you can't toss it out without me then just immediately asking that exact question, which I'm now going to do. And maybe I'd like you to start off, and then I'm going to turn to Umit next. But I mean, talk about that sense of moral responsibility. I think that's hugely important for what any of us do, not just not only in these circumstances, but in any community of scholars at a university. But in this specific case, we're talking about genocide, talking about trauma. Please, Salpi, continue on that point, please.
It's really simple, and it's something that I keep saying, I say it to our students, I say it to others who are just becoming familiar with this situation, that at the end of the day, my deepest understanding of what genocide and its immediate aftermath wasn't just by living with my grandmother, but it was by listening to people like Beth Meyerowitz and Don Miller at USC talking about the Rwandan experience and the immediate aftermath for those descendants and what did that mean. So the more we know of the other mass atrocities doesn't even cut it, but the more we know and share other experience with violence, I think the better we are at making the message about doing away with this violence, actually being responsible for it, a bit more relevant. And finally, the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, you know, repairing the world, being part of an individual's responsibility. Count me in. I absolutely have a responsibility to repair part of the world, my little corner somewhere. And that too, I think is, you know, upon all of us.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to turn right, Umit, if I can bring you exactly into what sort of the opening that Salpi just made. Do you see, how do you see, just speaking briefly, how do you see the purpose of the work that you've been doing? I mean, about what is the moral responsibility? In this case, what's the moral responsibility of a historian studying a situation which is just so difficult to get into? If you could, please.
Maybe I should start with my personal story about how I came to learn about the Armenians of my hometown and how I decided to study this subject and also write the book eventually. Following my graduation from my college, I found myself again at my parents' house in my hometown, Gaziantep, formerly known as Aintab, where I escaped the stifling heat and passed the days dozing on the sofa. And then a friend of mine just called me, you know, where have you been? Let's catch up and let's meet up in Kayacik. Although I was born and raised in Aintab and hadn't left the city until the college, the word Kayacik did not mean anything to me. It was just another district in the city, a neighborhood I had never visited, of which I knew nothing. So, and a friend of mine would wait for me at Papyrus Cafe and gave me directions. I took a bus to this neighborhood, and upon arrival, found myself this day's charming atmosphere, letting myself get lost in the side streets, leaving my poor friend waiting some more. So, embarrassed my obliviousness, I found myself asking, where am I? Where is this place? So I was on a narrow street, beautifully constructed stone houses lining each side, taking you back to a simpler, although slightly mysterious time, tucked away between the high-rise concrete apartment buildings of so-called modernized Gaziantep. So this neighborhood was like an architectural mirage. So I felt really nostalgic for a past that was never mine. And finally, I found this coffee shop, Papyrus Cafe, which turned out to be located in one of those exotic houses, like most of the houses on the street. Upon entering, a few letters carved at the top of the majestic gate caught my eye. So not recognizing the script, I simply assume these were Ottoman characters. Inside, I was once more speechless. Spacious courtyard with staircases on either side leading up to two large rooms welcomed me. The rooms were filled with antique furnishings and the high ceilings were adorned with frescoes and engravings similar to Florentine cathedrals. So, and feeling a surge of pride in my hometown and ancestor, I decided to talk to the owner to try to glean some information about the history of the house. I approached him intending only to compliment the establishment. And then, but before I could stop myself, I asked, I was just wondering, from whom did you get this place? Who was here before you? I asked him. He unwillingly explained that he inherited this place from his grandfather. So, and then it must have been especially the strong coffee they were serving that day. I was emboldened to press further. So, and how about your grandfather? From whom did he buy this place? The man paused hesitantly before responding, and then after a few moments, he softly murmured to the ground beneath him, "There were Armenians here." I said, "What Armenians? What are you talking about? Were there Armenians in Gaziantep?" He nodded. I was getting annoyed with this opacity of his answers. "So what happened to them? Where did they go?" I asked. He retorted indifferently, "They left." So as I rode the bus back home, I pondered why Armenians, why anyone would just leave and hand it over such an exquisite property to someone, you know. So I was naive to the point of ignorant 24 years old university graduate, unaware of the existence of Armenians in my hometown. So a few years later, I will find out the house belonged to Nazar Nazaretian, a honorary consulate to Iran, who was a member of the Aintab's wealthies and the most prominent family, and his children, his grandchildren used to live in this house. And those letters above the gate were not Ottoman, but Armenian, spelling out the surname of Black Karanazar Ağa, Black Nazar Ağa, who built the house. So years later, I will also have the chance to meet the youngest member of the family, Shushan. And after that moment, that building was no longer Papyrus Cafe for me. For me, it's the house of Karanazar Ağa, Nazaretian's home, the house where the grandmother of dear Shushan was born, and the old houses in the Kayacik. So this story is about my ignorance as a university graduate who attended one of the best schools in Turkey, Middle East Technical University, but lack of history of the Armenians in my hometown. So I was also victim of this historical indoctrination, you know, this educational system. So of course, I'm not trying to equalize the victimhood of Armenians and that of Turkish people, but Turkish people, intellectuals, high-trained people, highly educated people, white collars. Mostly, they are rather nationalists and also tended to extreme right-wing parties and so forth. This indoctrination, starting from the primary school, also this brainwashed, affected this difficulty of reckoning with the past, to a great extent. So, and also I want to focus on the one of the notions Salpi has pointed out is impunity. It's extremely important for the Armenian case because the perpetrators of this genocide, this crime against humanity, was not, punished. They were put on trial temporarily, and the trial were halted because of the political, situations and the political change in Turkey. Mustafa Kemal rose up, became the upper hand, established the country, and his rank and file, his cadre, the foundational members of this republic were the former perpetrators. And in 1926, perpetrators who were killed, by Armenian terrorist groups in the words of Turkish government, they were declared as national hero and bestowed upon by the Armenian abandoned properties in 1926. So this kind of history, this distorted history is, this is very hardcore, very solid, and being supported each and every day, reproduced each and every day in movies, in theaters, in arts, in cultural activities, in schools, in daily life, and so on and so forth. So we need a really, like the famous sociologist Holbox pointed out once, this mental leap, or the leap of mentality to change this structure. This is what can I say about the current situation.
Thank you so much, Umit. That was very powerful. I'm going to start now to integrate questions from the audience. There are a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to direct them as I think that I hope I get this right to specific panelists. I'm going to start with a question from Michael. Actually, or I'm interpreting this as a question from Michael. It's from one of the viewers named Monique Richardson, who writes, there are very few Holocaust survivors and rescuers left. Those of us who are the leading edge of the next generation are also aging. as we deal with questions of intergenerational trauma, should we start taking testimony from the children of survivors? Michael, I think that's a question pretty spot on for you, I hope. So, and then I'm going to follow with one for Beth. So Michael, please.
Well, first of all, I would say that there have been plenty of books, poems, plays, novels, films made by people who are second generation. So it's not as though folks in that situation have been silent. I do think if I would just call back to Michael Hagopian's premise about the importance of the first person, I mean, the question is, to what would they bear witness? They would bear witness to the legacy that they've inherited. They would bear witness to that intergenerational trauma and its inheritance, as Beth has talked about. They wouldn't, on the other hand, be bearing witness to the events, the original or originating events, we can say. But of course, I think we all should be in the habit of listening to one another. And when I think about StoryCorps or about other kinds of platforms and formats where people are able to tell their stories and share their experiences and even give voice to their own pain and the kind of gaps of knowledge that they've had, or the revisionist histories that they've discovered later in life about their families. I think it's really important. And at this moment, I'll mention a guy named Thomas Allen Harris, who is a wonderful artist and a kind of experimental documentary filmmaker. He's come to USC before. He's based on the East Coast, but he's done this thing called Family Portrait USA, and he works with groups around the country and the world using family images, photographs that allow people to begin to kind of unpack their own family histories and to talk about things that often have never been explored or discussed. So there is this opportunity that we really all should take advantage of listening to one another, listening to what it is that we think we know about ourselves and our identities and the things that we don't know. And much of that does have to do with painful memories that have been either repressed or silenced in some way or another. And so, yeah, I think there's much to learn from listening to one another.
Thanks, Michael. Beth, I'm going to direct this next question to you. It's from someone who is unnamed, so I'm not trying to hide the identity here, but so I'm just going to read the question. So I'm reading this from the Q&A. My grandparents were genocide survivors. My grandmother shared her experiences and miraculous survival with me starting when I was quite young. Although traumatic to hear, and I have a lifelong generalized anxiety disorder, I also feel in retrospect that her stories of survival built resistance in me. Is this common? Beth?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely it is. One of the things that we've learned is the tremendous resilience that people can develop as they learn about ways of surviving and ways of moving from that survival mode into a broader, more open way of living and accepting things. It's so the simple answer is it's both common and you should be congratulated. You should be congratulated for having really listened to what your grandmother had to say and finding ways to build resilience from that. As Michael just said, hearing other people's stories, really hearing them, is a great gift that we can give to other people. And it sounds as though you did that for your grandmother, and perhaps it had some positive impact for you as well.
Thanks, Beth. Salpi, I have a very specific question here. I think you're the person to answer this. I hope so. This is from Elaine Tarosian, who asks, are Hagopian's documentaries and interviews available to view? And I guess the question would be, if that's a yes, then how can one do so?
Well, they're all at the Shoah Foundation, all of the raw footage. This is what Michael did. He didn't do whole life stories. And maybe I should just let Michael respond. He didn't do whole life stories. He simply sat down and said, tell me what happened to your family. He was shooting 16mm film, and he was going after the actual violent the memories of the violence and the dispossession. And the Raw is all at Shoah. He has many, many short documentaries built on these, and the Armenian Film Foundation still has those. They should be available online, and if not, write us and I'll find them for you.
Okay, thanks. Michael, do you want to follow up on that since
Yeah, I just want to say that there was a trilogy that he made starting in the year 2000, Voices from the Lake, Germany and the Secret Genocide, and The River Ran Red. So between 2000 and 2009, he produced a trilogy of films that are available on DVD, I do believe, but I can't tell you a source right now. But if you make an effort, I know you're going to find them. And he did receive some Emmy nominations for the work that he did. It's it's a remarkable body of work. And the last film he finished at the age of 95.
And Peter, if I could just add, at the Shoah Foundation, all of the Raw is there, and much of it is available online through the Visual History Archives, so the VHA. So if you go into the Shoah Foundation site and do some digging, very simple digging, you'll be able to see these online sitting at home.
Thank you, Salpi. I think that's exactly the kind of practical advice, which is great to share. Okay, I have a question here, which I'm going to toss open. I think Michael might jump in first, but I'm going to toss it open to anyone who wants to jump in. It's from Alan Whitehorn. Fascinating question. Do we need both historical documentary accounts of mass murder to understand genocide at the analytical level, but also the personal accounts of survivors to connect us personally, mass murder to understand just analytical level, but also the personal accounts of survivors to connect us personally as outsiders? And that way, both the mind and heart are engaged about the plight of the victims. Does someone want to jump in on this question? I thought of Michael as a documentary film question, but really anybody could jump in on this.
Well, it's, go ahead. I've talked enough.
Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, please.
No, okay. From a historian point of view, I will say personal accounts do really matter, and they are essential sources. Especially if you work on or focus on certain provinces, cities, districts, towns, very micro scale and provincial level, these kind of sources are really, really invaluable and enrich your analysis, historical analysis, in order to elucidate and also shed light on what was happening on the ground. And actually now this is a growing tendency and also approach in the Holocaust literature as well. So Ömer Bartol, for instance, is a good example for this kind of work and so forth. So I really, it's highly importance of this personal accounts and the testimonial accounts as well, interviews. They do really make the difference, and they will bring nuanced approach to your analysis.
Thank you, Umit. I'm gonna read another anonymous question that came in, which I have to say is just so parallel to what's in the news. As I read this, the image in my mind, I'm about to read this, has to do with bystander responsibility. And I'm thinking about this terrible event in New York, maybe 10 days ago now, which I'm sure all of us have seen too many times. Now, that may not be what this person has in mind, so I'm going to read the question, but it goes to the question of bystanders. And the question is, what roles or responsibilities do bystanders today who are witnessing the attempt not only to deny a genocide, but also revise history to gaslight and blame the victims? That's what responsibility do we have when we see these efforts of denial going forward? The person then continues, this is mostly about the Armenian genocide, but also about Holocaust awareness, and then adds a comment, and I'm just repeating the question, so I'm not making a factual statement. I simply don't know the answer. I'm just repeating this. What does it mean that Facebook continues to allow Armenian genocide denial and only recently banned Holocaust denial? So if anybody wants to jump in on any of that, please jump in.
Well, I would like to say one thing,
please.
which is that
Thank
we're
you.
living through a moment of violence against Asians and Asian Americans and the proliferation of hate crimes. So I think we don't have to go very far. We can walk down the streets of our own city and know that kind of thing is happening. And I think one thing that we want to consider is replacing the word bystander with at least supplementing it with the word upstander. And that there are things that people can do, that we can do to form an alliance with people who are being attacked in some way, maybe verbally, maybe physically on the street. And it really comes down to an individual level of taking that level of responsibility instead of being a bystander, to think about how I can become an upstander.
One of the things that, just to follow up on that, one of the things that, one of the concepts that Dr. Straub wrote about, who himself was a Holocaust survivor, was the idea of altruism born out of suffering. And he talks about how people who have been through horrible traumatic events often are he calls it active bystanderism, but are active in these situations. And often one of the things that allows them to do that is that during their traumatic experience, one person showed some kindness toward them, helped them in some way. And so one of the things I think we can remember is that when we're willing to show that kind of kindness, even a simple act of kindness, it can reverberate for decades in someone's life and can really then influence them also to be an upstander just by having had that experience.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you, Beth, because I have a very specific question, which I think takes a clinical psychologist's insight here. The specific question from Mary Aloian is, how does transgenerational trauma manifest?
Yeah, it's a one sentence question and a complicated answer. And the reason that it's complicated is because traumatic stress manifests in a variety of ways. And maybe the best way to think about it is that a response to a traumatic experience leads us to a fight, or freeze response. And so the manifestations of traumatic stress can be fight. So it could be being aggressive, having behavioral problems, being angry all the time, being agitated, not being able to sleep. It could lead to flight, to withdrawal, to avoidance, to not engaging with people, to not being comfortable or safe in a variety of situations. Or it can lead to freeze, to feeling numb, to having no emotions, to feeling nothing. So when we look at the manifestation, they can almost look contradictory. One person could be very angry and another person could be completely numbed, but both could be in response to traumatic stress. One of the overriding things, though, is a sense of a change in worldview, a sense in the world, and this goes across all these categories, is a sense that the world isn't a safe place, that I can't trust the world to take care of me. I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel quite safe. I don't feel quite like I'm a person worthy of good things happening to me. That worldview is something that permeates many aspects of traumatic stress. Does that get at the answer, Peter?
Yeah, I think that's very good. I should say to the audience, I'm trying to keep up here with the Q&A and questions coming in the chat. So if I don't get your question, it's just that there are a lot of questions that have come in. But the next question is a very specific one. I think, Salpi, I'm going to start with you on this. It's from Teddy Bogosian, and the question is, how might President Biden's official recognition of the Armenian genocide reduce transgenerational trauma? I think that's a question up your alley, I hope. So can you start us there?
I would be happy to, but first let me tell you that Ted Bogosian is an award-winning filmmaker, and he made a film based on one of the very first video interviews of survivors that was done. And it was on public television, and I will be damned if I can remember the title of the film, but it was about Mariam Davis, who was adopted by an American family, came here, lived in the Georgia O'Keeffe, Stuart Davis, arts community, and remembered her orphanhood when she was 5. And Ted made a great public television film about that. So I think that the continuation of what Beth said a minute ago is that on the one hand, the stress response seems to be to distrust the world. On the other hand, we all say it, we all read it, we all hear it. Where is the world when I need them, right? We continue to go back and expect the world to save us from all of these horrible, horrible situations. And to the extent that consequence, that is recognition, that is calling things by their name, is extremely helpful and useful. It is really good that the American administration, now with Biden, is apparently seriously considering calling the genocide a genocide. However, I think that it is really important that we not allow the genocide or any other crime of this magnitude to be instrumentalized for political purposes. That is, if the genocide is going to be recognized because the US and Turkey, or Europe and Turkey, have issues, and they certainly do, I don't think that's a positive for either genocide recognition or for the safety and security of Armenians anywhere in the diaspora and certainly in the Republic of Armenia. I think that the way in which recognition is made, the words, the packaging is extremely, extremely important. And the only other thing I want to add to that is that recognition at the end of the day has to come from the Republic of Turkey. For the sake of Turkey and its development, Umit has said this several times, the foundational reality of building on political violence to establish statehood, Turkey needs to recognize for its own sake and, of course, for the descendants.
Great. Thank you, Salpi. Okay, I want to just point everyone, if you're looking at this in the chat, you'll see that Gerald Papazian has indicated that the Hagopian films are available through the Armenian Film Foundation at www.armenianfilm.org, and the trilogy that Michael spoke of, the Witness Trilogy, is available through Amazon. We're going to run out of time here soon. I'm going to, this may be the last question. This comes from Gina Nahai. This is addressed to everyone on the panel. I'm just going to read the question and then see who wants to jump in on this. And I think then we'll probably be out of time. Here's the question. I've spent my career documenting the intergenerational trauma experienced by Iranian Jews from the arrival of Islam till the Constitutional Revolution. I found that many, perhaps most, survivors of discrimination, victimhood, and atrocities, including massacres of non-genocidal level, react with anger and a certain level of denial to accounts of their victimhood. Many, it is true, feel vindicated and relieved that their experience is attested to. Many others have told me, that would be her, it's best to let those dogs lie. Have you come upon this phenomenon in your own research? And if so, to what do you attribute this attitude? I guess the attitude would be, should we just let the past be past? I hope, Gina, that was a fair summary of the question. Does anyone want to jump in on this question? We have very little time left.
The past is never past.
Oh, and we've already heard that it can transmute from generation to generation, and the silence is not really silence. It's an inaccessibility to language, but it doesn't mean that it isn't manifesting itself and can't continue to manifest itself in the future. So I think really the bravest, strongest approach is to attempt to articulate, to give voice in some way, to express and to share.
Thanks, Salpi. Oh, Beth, go ahead, sorry.
Just one quick thing I wanted to add to that is that going back to what Michael mentioned about being upstanders, I think it's incumbent on us to make certain that people who are doing that kind of sharing and are talking about those experiences are being able to do it in a safe place, that their safety is assured when those conversations happen.
Okay, we're running to a close here. I just want to say in passing, that some of these comments remind me, that sometimes, what's old comes back again. And when we talk about the past is still past, I feel like, pulling Faulkner off the shelf, and reading it. But it does seem to me that one of the important things that's happened here is a shout out to USC, is in the preservation and analysis of the film material, the interviews from the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, that we have helped create and preserve and archive to allow these really important questions continue to be addressed, not by just by our generation, but in generations to come. So talented psychologists like Beth can ask questions about what it means to be exposed to such things, and historians like Umit can then analyze what they mean in sort of contemporary political their contemporary political resonance. So I want to take this opportunity. I think we're out of time. If someone wants to correct me on that, please do. But I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists, Salpi, Umit, Beth, and Michael, for, I just found this a fascinating conversation. I'm glad this will be, I understand, archived and I think hope viewed by many people. And again, thank you to the Armenian Institute and the Kasdan. It was a great honor for me to be able to be here with you today. So with that, I turn it over to, who am I turning this over to? I think I'm at the end here. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Ross from the Kasdan Institute for the next comment. So Steve, over to you.
Well, like Peter, I want to thank all our panelists today for sharing their unique perspectives on a topic that continues to challenge both the Jewish and Armenian communities. And for doing it, this is a very set of complicated issues. And I really appreciate the clarity that all of you showed today in expressing different aspects of intergenerational trauma. And I want to thank not just our panelists, but the Institute of Armenian Studies again, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, the USC Armenian Students Association, and the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research for joining together and making this possible today. And we look forward to the day that we actually can gather in person. And we are proposing, the Kasdan is proposing a collaborative event with Salpi and the Institute of Armenian Studies that will be both an official debate and a taste test for panelists and audience to decide what is or what has the greater power to cure all diseases, Bubi's matzo ball soup or Tadik's sepas. I thank you in the audience for all joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at future events by the Kasdan Institute and by the Institute of Armenian Studies. Thank you, good night, shalom, and hajoch.